Standing. My name is Dr. Jacob Wobig. I am a professor here at Wingate in the Department of Political Science, where I teach the international relations related classes. And I'm here to welcome you to our Lyceum tonight about the Ukraine crisis. We have an outstanding panel of people from different parts of the Wingate community that can offer many different perspectives on what is going on and what does it mean to the people of Ukraine? What does it mean to the world? And what does it mean to us here at Wingate? So the plan for tonight is that it's a roundtable discussion where we have, I think, 7 different presenters. I will start us off with a brief discussion of the basic facts of what has happened over the last 3 weeks, but I'm going to put it in the context of the last several decades as well, to create a baseline. I know that not everybody necessarily is following the news of the day-to-day, and so I think it's nice to have that factual background. And then we will move into our panelists. So I'm just going to introduce them now, but they're going to get a chance to talk again here in a little bit. So the people on our panel for tonight, one is Dr. Joseph Ellis, who is an associate professor of political science here at Wingate and also the chair of our Department of History and Political Science. His research focuses on the Baltic states, which are also in Eastern Europe, just north of where this crisis is happening, particularly Estonia. So he has a great deal of knowledge and personal experience in this part of the world. Our next speaker will be Dr. Benjamin Thorne, who is Associate Professor of Modern History here at Wingate University. His research focuses on the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, particularly in Romania, Hungary, and Ukraine. His research in concentration camps, particularly with regard to that which was the Holocaust as administered by Romanians in Ukraine, has taken him to Odessa and that region of Ukraine multiple times. Our next speaker will be Katarina Decker. Ms. Decker was born and grew up in Western Ukraine, where she graduated with a degree in Slav languages with a concentration in the Ukrainian language. She taught Ukrainian at National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy in Ukraine before she came to the United States. She's been in the US for 22 years. Much of that time she taught Russian at Appalachian State, but recently she has come and joined us at Wingate, where she works as a technology consultant. Next will be Vasyl Kokla. Mr. Kokla was born and raised in Western Ukraine and attended university in Kyiv. He participated in the US State Department's Future Leaders Exchange Program and was also a fellow in the BB&T Free Enterprise Program, which brought him to Wingate roughly 10 years ago, where he took several classes here on our Wingate campus and became part of our community. Today, he manages a tax and accounting consultancy in New York City. With him is Maria Korun, who will be our next speaker. She is a US and Ukrainian trained attorney. She grew up in a village on the border of the Kharkiv Donetsk region in Eastern Ukraine, which is one of the areas most directly implicated in the events of the last 3 weeks. She attended law school in Odessa and then came to Wingate to join her husband in 2012. And after earning her law degree at Duke Law, she now runs her law office in the Ukrainian village of New York City, focusing on business and nonprofit matters. And in addition, since February 24th, she's been a full-time volunteer at Lyceum for Ukraine, which is one of the most active Ukraine-focused nonprofits in the United States. And then our final speaker for tonight is Dr. Magdalena Krajewska. She is Associate Professor of Political Science here at Wingate. Dr. Krajewska is an expert in both American and European politics, and her research focuses on issues related to migration and national identification documents. She also grew up in Poland, and so has a great deal of firsthand experience with the region that is under discussion for tonight. So I expect we'll probably have I'll talk for a little while. We'll have then a roundtable discussion that will last somewhere in the range of 45-ish minutes. And then our hope is to open it up to questions. And, this is one of the great opportunities to speak to people who have really great in-depth knowledge of the events which we're going to be talking about. As Carla mentioned, you can put questions in the chat. You can also save them to ask them to all of us. But also, if that's not something you want to do, I'm going to put my email address in the chat as well. If you want to make a question anonymously, just email it to me there, and I will find it and I can raise it later. So first, I have a little slideshow regarding the events of what is going on. So we're here to discuss the invasion of, where's my slide? There we go. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So just as about, the basic facts of the matter. Ukraine here in Eastern Europe, Russia is the larger country nearby. Ukraine and Russia have a long and complicated history that Dr. Thorne can go into far more detail. I'm just going to provide the very basic background. Ukraine was part of a larger country with Russia called the Soviet Union from 1921 to 1991, when Ukraine became an independent country. They originally were both democracies. Ukraine stayed a democracy, though one that had some pretty significant problems, but Russia converted back to dictatorship relatively quickly, particularly with the elevation to the presidency of a man named Vladimir Putin, who became president in 2000 and has pushed Russia further and further into a more authoritarian tilt. In the years since independence in 1991, Ukraine has straddled one of the key dividing lines of the world, which is this division between the West, which you might say as the United States and Europe and maybe a few other countries like Canada and Japan, and the post-Soviet world. And this has been a complication for Ukraine's foreign relations and their place in this period since the end of the Cold War. Over the last 30 years, many Ukrainians developed aspirations to become more closely tied to the West, and this has been intensely threatening to Russia. The event that really begins this current era, it occurs in 2013 and 2014. There was a Ukrainian president at that time who wanted to pursue deeper trade relations with Russia rather than the European Union. And this kicked off a series of protests by the Ukrainian people who saw this as an example of the corrupt influence of Russia on Ukrainian politics. They wanted to separate themselves from this sort of traditional influence of Russia. The Russian-supported president then fled the country, but in retaliation, Russia then invaded and annexed a southern portion of Ukraine called Crimea, which was one of the very first examples of a country taking the territory of another country since World War II. And also Russia was involved in invading and then supporting militias that were trying to take this part of the country, it's called the Donbass, out of Ukraine, either to become an independent country under Russian influence or even just become part of Russia itself. In this region on the east, war has continued since that time. There has been a war for 8 years there. During those 8 years, Ukraine continued to develop ties to the West. And this has only angered Putin and his aspirations for Ukraine even more. And one of the triggering events for this was that last year, the Ukrainian government initiated a crackdown on corruption that included rounding up several of Putin's favorite pro-Russian politicians, or at least removing them from their positions of influence. Russia responded by initiating a military buildup, putting about 200,000 soldiers on the Ukrainian border, and then
a class?
Oh, that was weird. Let me try to do that again. Oh, it just disappeared entirely. Okay. Well, I can talk while PowerPoint's booting up again. Russia put 200,000 soldiers on the Ukrainian border, and then about 3 weeks ago, they invaded. Um, this invasion has, here we go, perfect. Slideshow, play from start. Now share. This invasion has led to, well, let me start, go back a little bit. I got thrown. There are three stated reasons why Russia says they're invading. One, they say they're there to rescue Ukrainians from what they call fascists and drug users in the Ukrainian government. Two, they say that Ukraine was not willing to grant independence to separatists in the eastern part of the country. And then third, in a long speech that Vladimir Putin gave recently, he said that Ukraine was really a part of Russia, has always been a part of Russia, and did not have a right to exist independently, basically regardless of what Ukrainians thought about the matter. So war is terrible, as war always is. You can see on this map, this is as of last night, Russia has managed to take some territory, and they have developed a pattern of launching military attacks on civilian population centers, which has led to thousands of deaths and millions of people fleeing the violence. However, to the surprise of many commentators, Russia has struggled much more than many of us expected. They have failed so far to take the key cities of Kyiv and Kharkiv, which are seen by most as the keys to Ukraine. And they also have incurred astonishing casualties. Thousands of deaths. We're not really certain for sure, but somewhere in the range of 3,500 up to 6,000 casualties, which is as many casualties as the United States suffered in the entire 8 years of the Iraq War. Russia has already suffered that in 3 weeks. But although it's also the case that Ukraine has lost somewhere in the order of 2,000 to 4,000 killed in action, according to most estimates. In addition, Russia has lost something like 300 tanks, 1,000 armored personnel vehicles, 80 helicopters, 50 jets, and more than 100 pieces of artillery and rocket launchers, as well as thousands, well, closing in on 1,000 trucks. This has led to many, if you look on Twitter, it's full of photographs of abandoned or destroyed Russian military equipment that is being dragged out of fields by Ukrainian farmers. In many cases, what happened is the Russians moved ahead of their supply lines. They just ran out of fuel and they had to abandon their military equipment, which is now in Ukrainian possession. To this point, Ukraine is mostly fighting Russia alone. The United States and Europe have friendly relations with Ukraine, but we've never had an alliance. Ukraine has repeatedly requested military assistance, but to this point, neither the United States nor other countries have sent military forces because we do not want to get into a direct military conflict with Russia. This is predominantly because of the fear of the possibility of a nuclear war should nuclear powers actually end up in a shooting war with each other. However, to this point, the United States and Europe have provided a fair amount of aid in the form of military equipment, like missiles, small arms, an attempt to send jets, military jets to Ukraine. And in addition, the United States and other countries have implemented pretty intense economic sanctions on Russia. In fact, some of the strictest sanctions that have ever been employed on any country outside of maybe North Korea and Iraq in the 1990s. Okay, we'll just go without the PowerPoint slide. And this has potentially led to, am I still in share screen or can you see me? I see people shaking my hands. You're seeing me, not the shared screen?
Yeah,
we can see you.
Okay, great. Thank you. There is serious economic trouble coming for Russia. We have cut off their access to global markets in a lot of ways. We've cut off their ability to use dollars in international markets as well. We basically boycotted their sale of oil. And this is going to lead to serious economic pain for Russia in the hopes that this will cause them to rethink what they're doing. It's important to understand, however, this will also mean economic pain for all of the us. If you boycott somebody, what that effectively does is raise the prices on whatever you're boycotting. We've already seen substantial increases in oil prices, which of course is going to mean higher gas prices, and also increased prices in things like wheat and corn, nickel, and other things that come from Russia or Ukraine. These are ways that this is going to impact you. And the final thing I was going to say is that this war has also produced a tremendous flow of refugees. As of yesterday, 3 million people have fled Ukraine for other countries. There is probably a much larger number who are displaced inside Ukraine as they've had to flee their homes to try to escape violence. It is one of the worst refugee crises, particularly in terms of the size of the increase in such a short period of time since World War II, and is an incredible humanitarian burden well, the Ukrainian people predominantly are going to be the ones bearing it, but European states that are nearby are hopefully going to try to help as well. That's my introduction to what has happened. I would like to now ask Dr. Ellis to give us his perspective on how do you understand the Ukrainian crisis?
Thanks, Dr. Wobig, and I'm just going to speak from my kind of vantage point in studying the Baltic states. As many of you know, a few weeks ago, we did sort of a broad overview of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and some of the historical pieces there. And I think Dr. Thorne may add some to that. I just want to really talk about two things briefly. And that's the role that I think personal experience in Eastern Europe with Russia, long predating Putin and going back even perhaps before the Soviet Union, how that impacts how folks in the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, people in Ukraine, and even people in Russia understand this issue. And I think personal experience with Russia or the Soviet Union breeds a sort of particular wisdom or perspective that from our vantage point in America, we might see this differently. For Americans, our view of Russia has largely been intellectual in nature. Of course, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and of course, there was the Cold War itself. But in both World War I and World War II, the United States and Russia had something of an alliance, right? More than an alliance in the case of World War II. And so for Americans, we have seen Russia and the Soviet Union broadly through kind of images. That's not the case if you've lived in Estonia or Ukraine or Lithuania or Latvia. What's interesting about this issue to me, not this issue, this war to me, is that principally speaking, everyone, maybe even China, according to some things we've heard today, is in agreement that Russia is the aggressor, Russia is clearly the bad guy, and Ukraine is clearly the victim in this case. It is so rare in world politics that we agree on the kind of principles of the matter, right? So what do we disagree on? We disagree on some technical details that are quite important. And I think one of those technical details that's quite important is the extent to which the United States and Western Europe, through the auspices of NATO, will be involved in this war. And that's where there's disagreements. And I think in part, those disagreements stem from Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania's deep experience dealing with Russia over, we could go back hundreds of years if we wanted to, but at least over the last 100 years, and the way Americans, and to a lesser extent, Western Europeans have understood it over the last 100 years. Okay, let's think about three things. Let's think about how we process risk. Let's think about how we reflect on the past, and let's think about how we prepare for the future. In the Baltics in particular, they have been incredibly risk averse as it pertains to dealing with NATO and the United States. And what I mean by that is that no matter who the American president is, no matter who the Secretary General of NATO is at the time, Estonians have sort of bent over backwards to support, and at least, if nothing else, give lip service to the fact that the United States and NATO are major players in Estonia's safety, right? What's interesting, though, is that in the past few weeks, since the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, Estonians and Ukrainians and Latvians and Lithuanians have been not just a little more vocal, but a lot more vocal in even opposition to the United States and NATO in their view of sort of laying out or staying away from a few key factors, including, I think the biggest one at this point is the issue of a no-fly zone. Yesterday, the Estonian parliament passed a resolution supporting a no-fly zone. Almost everyone in the parliament agreed to this. And Ukraine, of course, has asked for this too. But Estonia asking for it's a little bit different because, again, Estonia has pretty much played very nice with the United States and NATO for most of its existence because, of course, the United States and NATO play a major role in supporting its defense. It's a small country. It's much smaller geographically and population-wise than Ukraine. Like Ukraine, it shares a border, but it has much less military wherewithal even than Ukraine, NATO notwithstanding. Why might someone in Eastern Europe, okay, see this differently than someone in the United States or Western Europe? As you know, NATO has been opposed to the no-fly zone. The US is opposed to this. And I think because, right, the experience breeds a certain sort of wisdom and perspective that maybe Americans can't appreciate. And I'm not making an argument. I'm not a military strategist. I'm not making any kind of argument for or against a no-fly zone today. But I wanted to say a couple things, and then I'll turn it over because I really want to hear what our speakers have to say, our invited guests have to say today. Russian aggression stands to harm its neighbors to the east, or excuse me, to the west, much more than it stands to perhaps harm the United States in the short term, in the near term. The Baltic states and Ukraine fear that inaction, I'll repeat that, the Baltic states and Ukraine fear that inaction will lead to more bloodshed, okay? The US and NATO view is that action, the United States or NATO doing something, would escalate and lead to more bloodshed. So why might someone in the Baltic states or Ukraine be willing to take on this gamble? And I think in part it has to do with personal experience. Every Estonian family, probably every Ukrainian family, has some story of Russian or Soviet aggression in their history. And this impacts their calculation considerably. And for much of the Cold War, the United States and NATO sort of largely set out of these issues. So when things went on in Poland or in Czechoslovakia or in Hungary, or the things that went on in the Soviet Union proper, the United States did not get involved. The United States was not involved in trying to rescue Estonians that were put on trains and sent to Siberia. That did not happen. And so as we reflect on this issue, and I'll close with this, I want to be mindful of the fact that our personal experiences impact how we view politics, right? And the fact that for many Americans, we see this through the lens of kind of an intellectual lens. It's worrisome, it's scary, and we can't help it, right? We don't live in those regions. But for those literally on the front lines and figuratively on the front lines, they have every right to perhaps think differently on this issue. Now, I'll close by saying this. Estonians, after watching the performance of the Russian military in Ukraine, is maybe a little less scared than they were before. But nevertheless, their call for action, I think, indicates a sort of history that Americans have not lived through, at least particularly on this issue. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Dr. Thorne, can I get your perspective on this?
Sure. Well, I just want to briefly touch on the myths that Putin is using to justify the invasion, since as a historian, I think that's what I'm perhaps most equipped to address. And as you mentioned, Putin justifies the invasion because, as he alleges, Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis. He justifies the invasion by saying that the existence of an independent Ukraine is a historical fallacy. It's illegitimate. And he justifies the invasion by saying that Ukrainians and Russians are really one people. The idea that they represent distinct ethnic groups or nations is a delusion foisted upon Ukrainians, that Putin, for the betterment of Ukraine, hopes to deprogram them of, I suppose. So I'll address first the issue of denazification. Well, like any country in Europe, or the United States for that matter, or many other countries in the world, you do have, of course, some anti-Semitism in Ukraine, and there's no point in denying that. But I think that to put that in perspective, we should note a few things. One, Ukraine has one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe presently. If you look online, you'll see many different figures, but I think somewhere between 200 and 500,000 Ukrainians of Jewish heritage or descent, even if they don't identify as Jews, is a sound range. You would not have that many people living there if they felt a constant sense of danger because of their Jewish identity or their Jewish heritage. You also probably would not have had 73% of the electorate vote for a Jewish president, which is what Ukraine has currently with Volodymyr Zelensky. And at the time he was elected, I believe there was a prime minister who was also Jewish. So this notion that somehow the Ukrainian government is run by Nazis is absurd on the face of it. To address the other two justifications, these myths, we do need to look, I think, at Ukraine with sort of a broad historical lens. Dr. Wobig mentioned an article that Putin published, I believe last summer, a very lengthy one in which he laid out all the reasons why Ukraine is really part of Russia. And at one point in time, Ukraine certainly was part of Russia and the Soviet Union. But in order to make this claim, he's ignoring quite a bit of history. So for example, if you look at the territories that today comprise Ukraine, and I'm going to include Crimea in that, even though it's currently occupied by Russia, the area that comprises Ukraine today, at one point in time belonged variously to Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Kingdom of Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Crimean Khanate, all of which, if you're keeping score, are not Russia. So there's a bit of a hole in the argument that Ukraine has always been part of Russia, if you're just looking at borders and how they're drawn. What he's really using as the root of this argument is the fact that the origins for what you would call today modern Russian culture, the modern Russian state, is this medieval country called Kievan Rus. Kiev is the capital of Ukraine today. It was the capital of this medieval principality. It's seen as the root of the Russian state as it would develop over the centuries since then. Kievan Rus, the founding of it was over 1,000 years ago. That's how far back Putin has to stretch to try to make this case. And in the meantime, he's ignoring vast swaths of time, centuries, when Ukraine was not part of Russia. So I want to point that out. And then in terms of this idea that Ukrainians and Russians are one people and have always been one people, and any sense of separateness has been engineered artificially, if you look at, Ukraine in the 19th century, you have people who are articulating a separate sense of Ukrainian identity. The people who lived in various parts of Ukraine experienced very different histories, historical trajectories, through their history. If you look at just the modern period, let's say 20th century to the present, you have in the Tsarist Empire efforts at expressing Ukrainian culture being suppressed, attempts to use the Ukrainian language for literature and education forbidden, which would suggest that in the first instance, there was that sense of separate identity. If you look at the Soviet Union, the period in time where perhaps Putin could make the strongest case, I suppose, for a unitary state with Russia and Ukraine, that comprises one of Ukraine's greatest historical tragedies. The Holodomor, a forced famine in which 5 million people died, caused by Stalin. For Ukrainians, that's such an important cultural touchstone that it helps to define Ukrainian identity today, as opposed to a Russian one. So all of these justifications are just myths. And Putin is inflicting a nightmare upon Ukraine today, in part due to this imaginary idyllic past. But Ukrainians are enduring this nightmare for the dream of a better tomorrow. And I'm very glad that we're having this presentation so that we can bring light to this issue. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Thorne. Ms. Decker, what would you add to this conversation?
Good evening. So I was born and grew up in Western Ukraine, and my experience was pretty much up until I was 16 years old. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And the summer when I actually finished school and was accepted to the university, and I was getting ready to start my studies at the university, that was the summer when Soviet Union fell apart. And I will never forget the day when Ukraine announced its independence, because it's my birthday, it's August 24. So that was the day when Ukrainian independence was announced. And for me at that time, I wasn't really that big of a deal. It just, okay, so we're now a different country. But I watched my grandmother at that time, and she could not believe what she saw. She was born in 1931, and she was a little child during World War II. She saw World War II, and she lived through many bad times of the Soviet Union, when Russia had attitude to the republics like Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and other republics had a very superior attitude. So the local languages were humiliated and they were not encouraged at school. For example, there was a word for Ukraine as Malorossia, like Little Russia. And so local Russian language was encouraged and was really required in many in all republics, pretty much.
You know what type of time are we on?
Also, Russia really controlled in schools what students can do or what is taught. It's important to understand for American students how much control that regime and that system was able to instill. Like you saw at the beginning, the map of Russia, it's huge. I think it's 7 time zones, so even, I don't remember, maybe 9 time zones. I am from Western Ukraine, all the way on the west. And I have here a friend in Charlotte who is from Khabarovsk, which is far eastern part of Russia. And when we meet, it feels like we grew up in the same town. We know the same holidays, we know the same traditions, we know the same dishes, we know everything. So that much was control everywhere. And control was to the point that atheism was instilled in schools everywhere, to such point that you would be punished if schools know that you go to church or your family goes to church. I really witnessed when I was at school that if families take their children, like for Easter or Christmas, to church, they really would send people to church to watch who takes children there. And then when you get to school and they have a list who they saw there, you can be a perfect girl or boy getting all A's, but you will have B or C for behavior because they saw you in church. So that is kind of important. And that was all over in the Soviet Union and republics. So the control was just huge. So for my grandmother to really hear that Ukraine is now independent and Ukrainian, everybody, we can speak freely Ukrainian language, she really was even like, she was crying, and just was very hard for her to believe in that. So at this point, Ukrainians, like I am from a big family. My mom is from the family where there were 7 of them. So all my uncles and aunts are in Ukraine with their families. So they are all still there. And 2 of my uncles lived near Kiev in the town of Irpin, which has been on the news lately very much because it's occupied by Russians. And I'm happy that my uncles moved their families to the western part of Ukraine where other family members live, but they communicate with other people. And it's just scary and unbelievable to hear what's going on right now. And as it was mentioned before, Ukraine really was hoping to, there is so much financial help and help in terms of supplies. There are many volunteers who go to help army, but still this is not enough. Ukrainians are upset because of the lack of support. For example, one of the facts that comes out very often lately, that when Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, Ukraine was number 3 largest nuclear power in the world. Well, why? Because Ukraine was strategically located between NATO and Russia, right? So it was logical to put all the nuclear arsenal on the Ukrainian territory. So when Soviet Union fell apart, it was dangerous to have such country with so much nuclear weapons. And this was the time where some of the European countries went through change of power. For example, in Yugoslavia was very violent change of power. And American government, NATO, was just afraid about having these countries in Europe with so much nuclear weapons, because you never know what happens if sudden violent change of power happens in Ukraine or some other country. So Ukraine was approached and asked to get rid of the nuclear weapons. And Ukraine wanted the guarantee of the security and protection if they get rid of the nuclear weapons. So in 1994 in Budapest, there was so-called memorandum, like a meeting between US, I think Great Britain was there, Russia, and Ukraine. And this memorandum pretty much offered a peaceful security and protection for Ukraine from Russia and from Ukraine, from US, in case there is any threat ever to Ukraine. So since then, Russia violated all those promises in 2014. When there were also protests in Ukraine, and of course now. So, but that was just a memorandum. There was not like guarantee to enter the war or something like that. So that's something that comes up very much lately, and Ukrainian people are upset. all of you have heard about sanctions against Russia. Unfortunately, seems like sanctions are partial in some ways because, for example, many airlines stopped flying to Russia, but in Europe, there are many small private airlines who still fly to Russia. So there is really a way to get in and get out. So it's really not 100% as it might seem. Also, like Russia was disconnected from SWIFT, and it is true that they were not able to do many financial transactions. At the same time, they are really finding ways to, for example, I just watched the other day somebody from Russia showing how on iPhone you can change settings and Apple Pay will work and you can just buy whatever you want. So there are still ways. So this is like really, really upsetting to many people. At the same time, what hurts is this whole war is really unexpected and shocking for Ukrainians because during Soviet Union, we all grew up with the sense of we are brothers. We fought in World War II. Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians, we help each other, we help rebuild. So we all grew, there was really never animosity among simple people, but everything that's going on is just brought so much and quite understandable negative attitudes and just hatred from people of different nationalities and like between Ukrainians and Russians. So this is, and at the same time, when this is happening, when Ukrainians are dying, about 70% of Russians are really supporting this war and really supporting their president. And they feel that there is a threat from the West and what's happening right now, they are, and I have friends here who are Ukrainian and have relatives in Russia. And when they are talking like recently to them and they're saying, oh, you are misled. We are really helping to clean Ukraine from nationalists. But interestingly, they started the war attacking the most Russian cities in Ukraine. Kharkiv, Mariupol, Kherson are really Russian cities. This is where all Russian-speaking population lives. And how you are denationalizing Russian population, they really don't even have Ukrainian-speaking people there. So all those things are just not adding up. But at the same time, it's important to understand how Russia is really controlling the media. They really do not have access to everything we have here. Now they are blocking Facebook, they are blocking Twitter, they are blocking many social media channels, and their TV is pretty much all that people are fed all the time. So, and something that's been happening, I read about it for a long time, and I met many people here in Charlotte even, like I met scientists who fled Russia because somebody in his lecture, he had his own points of view and students reported, and his wife or their car was blown up. So people could not really speak up in Russia. And Russia experiencing for quite a long time, this so-called intellectual drainage, like the intellectuals are leaving Russia, educated people, smart, free-thinking people have been leaving Russia for a very long time. And people who are left are really brainwashed by their TV channels and with this illusion of fascism and threat from the West. And even those people who are trying right now to protest in Russia, they are being arrested. And if they speak openly, they will get 15 years in prison. Like they cannot openly speak to support this war, and the world war is not allowed to be used now in Russia. They call this as military operation. So that's that's pretty much what I wanted to share. And something else that came to mind when I, in my teaching work as a Russian instructor, I have taken students to Europe, to Berlin, Prague, Krakow, Budapest. And when we went to Krakow, we went to the site of the Auschwitz concentration camp. And when you enter that place, you are faced with this huge wall that has this big sign. Those who do not know history are bound to repeat it. And this is just like so true and so devastating. This is exactly what's happening. Unbelievable, hard to get used to, and very unfortunate.
Thank you very much, Ms. Decker. Vasil and Maria, would you mind, bringing in your perspective to this situation?
Yeah, I really like what Dr. Ellis said about personal experience, and I would like to share a story of my paternal grandfather to share how he viewed development of Ukraine. So he was born in 1924, and he was born in the region between Eastern Galicia and Western Galicia, in so-called Lemko land, ethnic group of Lemkos. That's group mixed in ethnogenesis. That's a combination of Ukrainians, Poles, Romanians, Hungarians, Slovaks. So it's a very mixed group, but the predominant sentiment, especially in Eastern Lemkovina, which is about like one hour driving from the modern day Ukrainian border, the predominant sentiment in that area was that of Ukrainianness. People in Eastern Lemkovina identified strongly as Ukrainian, and he was 5 years old when the Ukrainian Unity Act was proclaimed in 1924, when Western Ukraine joined the rest of Ukraine, so-called bigger Ukraine. And when he was 15, he was taken as a forced labor to Germany, and he did forced labor in Germany for 4 years. And then he returned. As soon as he returned in 1945, he thought, okay, great, I am back here in Eastern Lemkovina. I can enjoy my life with the family again. But it didn't happen so, because in 1946, the Soviet Communist government and the Polish Communist government signed the treaty about the resettlement of Ukrainians or mixed group, such as the ones that my grandfather belonged, because the idea was to create a pure nation in Poland and so on. So his family was forcefully resettled to today's Western Ukraine, Eastern Galicia, in Ivano-Frankivsk region. It used to be known as Stanislavo in Polish times. So they couldn't keep their possessions, even though my grandfather's father came to America several times and worked in the mines. He made good money. They built a nice house, but they couldn't keep it. They lost everything, and it was a big family. My grandfather had 6 siblings. So after they were dumped, and an interesting part about that is resettlement in different areas of Ukraine. And that's the reason I have relatives in different parts of Ukraine. So they were taken into the cattle trains, and some were dumped in Western Ukraine villages, some were dumped in Central Ukraine, some in Eastern Ukraine. So my great-grandfather had a heart attack 1 year later because he couldn't take it anymore, and a realization that he lost all of that. And like my grandfather was the one who was settled in Western Ukraine. He had to work in kolkhoz, and he was really anticipating independent Ukraine. He was like really thrilled when Ukraine's independence did happen in 1991. And I remember going to the village and having a conversation with him, and asking him, Grandpa, yeah, Ukraine is independent, but what do you make of Ukraine being very poor, though? And he goes, you know what, Vasil, it's okay that we are poor, because eventually we'll get out of the whole little by little, our democracy will become stronger, our status in the world will become stronger, but the most important thing that we are independent now. So my grandfather died in 2009 at the age of 85. And when I speak with my relatives, I tell them perhaps it's good that he didn't see what happened in 2014 and what is happening right now, because it would be like really heartbreaking experience for him. He thought Ukraine was on the up and up, and he thought that 1991 was it, and he saw the Orange Revolution, was very happy about that development of Ukraine, but it didn't really happen like this. But back to that resettlement point, as I mentioned, some of my relatives are in Eastern Ukraine too. So since March the 1st, I didn't even have any way to connect with my relatives around Volnovakha, Mariupol, and Berdyansk in Eastern Ukraine that are under Russian siege. People lost water, electricity, food. So I don't even know if they are alive at this point. Like, I'm hoping and praying that they are, but that's just very, very devastating times for Ukraine. Thankfully, that segment of the family in Western Ukraine is okay. We're witnessing huge mushrooming of refugees. For example, my aunt is in Uzhhorod, right by the Hungarian and Slovak border. The population in their city was 150K. Now it's at least to 250K. Even in my hometown, it's Kalush, it's about 70K. So now there are many more refugees there. And then Western Ukraine is also interesting from the perspective of religious diversity. Because in Ukraine, when you talk about Protestants, you have about 2% Protestants throughout Ukraine. But Western Ukraine is about 10%, and some villages even 70%. So I think what's interesting is that the reason that religious pluralism was possible in Ukraine is because that's a testament to Ukrainian democracy. While in Russia, for example, in 2018, Jehovah's Witnesses were outlawed as a group, and that was interesting precondition as we saw the Russian government taking more and more drastic moves to prevent freedoms, including religious freedoms, like we saw with Jehovah's Witnesses in 2018. Then eventually it even got to the point of invading Ukraine, because as Ms. Decker said, Ukrainians knew that that we were dealing with that war since 2014, but we still didn't expect that the full-scale invasion would happen. Even Maria and I were thinking, well, perhaps Putin is trying to squeeze Ukraine economically and intimidate and threaten Ukraine and force Ukraine to agree to that neutrality status. But he actually did go ahead with the full-scale invasion. And then another thing I'd like to talk about is the role of universities. Universities are the laboratories of reconceptualizing reality. So as students are immersed in the academic environment, they have an opportunity to think what's going on and where the world is going off, where the world's response is not up to par, and also do research about about different countries. And when we talk about research, Kyiv School of Economics did a lot of research about Ukrainian economic standing. And what's noteworthy is that, for example, to see the difference between 2014 and right now. So as of 2014, 35 million around the globe, mainly in Middle East and Africa, relied on Ukraine for food. Right now, the figure is 350 million of people rely on Ukraine for food. And if we talk about a grain export in Ukraine, it went from 3% in 2014 to 11% right now. And then when you talk about trade with Russia, it used to be 1/3 of Ukrainian trade was with Russia as of 2014, and only 5% now. So there was some survey or study of the countries that have most say in the world, and Ukraine was ranked within top 30 countries that have some say in the world. So I think what happened that the Ukrainians were underestimated by the world, because there is still a lot of notion that Ukraine is very close to Russia. I mean, there was, at least until 2014. And in 2014, people started realizing, well, Ukraine is not quite the same thing as Russia. And especially right now, see, if I used to explain to people, Ukraine is not the same as Russia, because some people were still wondering how close to are. But at this point, I don't have to elaborate on that, because the level of consciousness in the world is such that people realize Ukraine wouldn't be in this bloody war with Russia had the population of people considered itself a part of Russia. And the final point I'd like to make is about the tipping point. Sometimes people ask me, why Ukraine and why now? They say, well, how about all the people that suffered in Syria or in Iraq or Vietnam or other parts of the world? And all of that's true. And I agree with them that it's heartbreaking what happened in those countries, like Syria, losing 500,000 civilian population. And when we consider human suffering, we don't differentiate by nation. It's just human suffering, no matter where it is. But what I'm hoping may happen this time is that we are reaching a tipping point, because what was so jarring is that the war happened in Europe, that and people got desensitized to wars in the Middle East because of the frequency of military conflicts there. But in Europe, since that war broke, the major war after World War II, that was so jarring for the world. So what I'm hoping that the world society, people of the free world are reaching a tipping point. And I illustrate that with a personal example. It took me 29 years to start exercising regularly. I tried and gave up, but finally it did stick. So for the last 3 years, I've been exercising regularly. So that idea of a tipping point, so my answer to people when they say, Vasil, why is Ukraine such a big deal? You know, why Ukraine? Why now? I'm saying, well, you know, maybe you're right. A lot of conflicts were just glossed over, and a lot of suffering was turned a blind eye to. But perhaps the world is reaching that tipping point where the world cannot stand things like that anymore. And the UN resolution actually shows that the vast majority, 144 or so countries, voted in favor for Ukraine. And even countries like the former Soviet bloc abstained from the vote. So Putin's propaganda failed significantly, because even if some of the biggest allies of Putin supposedly failed, and a Kazakh dictator refused to send troops to Ukraine, that was a big upset for Russians too. So my hope is that we're really reaching the tipping point, and there is a lot of hope that the world is uniting around the cause in Ukraine, and that perhaps we don't want to go through so much inaction, as Dr. Alice said. So that's why I'm hoping that people will say, let's not wait for the future action, because when we count all the casualties, by the time we reach that action, there will be millions and millions of casualties. So the sooner the world takes action, the better it will be. I'm just hoping that we have reached the tipping point now.
Thank you, Mr. Kokla. Ms. Corin?
Yes, I prepared a few things and I would like to read them, because the further we go into the event, I don't know, if I can keep being tearless or not. So I'd like to read something. Between Vasil and me, we cover all Ukraine. Vasil is from the West and studied in Kiev, northern Ukraine. I am from the East and studied in Odessa, southern Ukraine. We have a strategic partnership here. So it is hard to answer the questions like, how are you? And I hope everybody is okay. You see the footage that's coming from all areas of Ukraine. It's rough and everybody is not okay. So I am thankful that my immediate family members are alive whenever they are in Ukraine, and try to thankfully pray and meditate over this personal good news. I understand that you had an event 2 weeks ago when you explored the beginning of this war. like you now, 2014 caught me in beautiful North Carolina during my law school years. The occupation of Crimea and war in Eastern Ukraine were shocking. The Ukrainian community in North Carolina gathered to support each other, as well as raise funds for essentials to support Ukraine. And many American friends lifted us as well. The brutal night of February 23rd of this year, 3 weeks ago, caught me amidst a busy life in New York City. Concerns like developing my business, making new connections after 2 years of COVID closures suddenly became secondary to a shock, inability to accept that Russia attacked Ukraine, constant worries, cries, protests, praise, fundraisers, and action points to support my violently attacked country. Interestingly, if you ask a Ukrainian what day of the week it is, she may hesitate to tell you, but she will tell you what day of the war it is. I am now coordinating work of a newly created legal coalition for Ukraine immigration questions. This coalition consists of bar associations, legal services organizations, law firms, and solo attorneys. As of today, over 3 million Ukrainians left Ukraine due to safety concerns, most of them women, children, people with disabilities, children with disabilities, and the elderly. It's estimated that 10 million Ukrainians will leave Ukraine due to this war. 10 out of 40 million people. You hear that the United States accepts refugees. As of now, there is no formal program for the Ukrainian refugees to come. I'm learning to accept that the things announced on Twitters and media are not the things that take place in reality, unfortunately. Ukrainians who are coming to the US now come on temporary visas if they are lucky to get one. They have no right to stay here past the initial 6 months, no work authorizations, no support network. So our coalition is working with New York and New Jersey local officials and state officials to help create an infrastructure for our de jure tourists, but de facto refugees. We remain hopeful and encouraged by the resilience of our people in Ukraine, our leaders, and we do everything that we can here. I encourage you to visit the webpage of razumforukraine.org. That's an organization where Vasil and I volunteer, and support it by reaching out to your local officials, by donating and praying for our country. Also, Wingate University, I believe you had a good run with Vasil, so please consider inviting other bright students from Ukraine. They will appreciate the opportunity. And in the end, I'd like to read 2 poems. Both describe our reality. One is, both are hard, but my favorite one is the last one. And it's also my hope and my prayer. So the first poem is called Stalin's Heirs, Heirs of Stalin, and it's written in 1962 by a Russian poet, Yevgeny Yevtushenko. Stalin died in 1953. The poem is written in 1962. The marble was silent. The glass glistened silently. The guards stood silent, bronzing in the sun. But the coffin gave off a faint vapor. Breath leaked through a crack. When they took it through the mausoleum doors, the coffin slowly floated past, its corners touching the bayonets. He too was silent, but frighteningly silent, silently clenching embalmed fists. Inside, the man pretending dead pressed against the crack. He wanted to remember all those who were carrying him out, young Ryazan and Kursk recruits, so that afterwards, somehow, he might gather the strength for a sally and rise from the earth and get at these rash persons. He had thought of something. He had merely nestled down for a rest. And I appeal to our government with the request to double, to triple the guard at this slab so that Stalin may not rise, and with Stalin, the past. I am not speaking of that treasured valorous past, which was, and the flag over Berlin. Here, I mean by the past, the ignoring of the people's welfare, the calumnies, the arrests of the innocent. We sowed honestly, we poured steel honestly, and we marched honestly, lining up in soldiers' ranks. But he feared us, believing in a great goal. He did not believe that the means should be worthy of the great goal. He was farsighted, skilled in the laws of battle. He left many heirs on the face of the globe. I dream that a telephone has been placed in the coffin. Stalin sends his instructions to Enver Hoxha. Where else does the line from the coffin run? No, Stalin has not given up. He considers death remediable. We rooted him out of the mausoleum, but how to root Stalin out of Stalin heirs? Some of the heirs snip roses in retirement and secretly consider the retirement temporary. Others even condemn Stalin from the platform, but themselves at night pine for the old days. Evidently, not for nothing do Stalin heirs today suffer heart attacks. They, once his lieutenants, do not like these times when the camps are empty and the halls where people listen to poetry are crowded. The party ordered me not to be quiet. Let some repeat over and over. Relax. I cannot be calm. As long as Stalin's heirs exist on earth, it will seem to me that Stalin is still in the mausoleum. And another poem is written way before the Soviet Union appeared to be. It's in 1890, written by a beautiful Ukrainian soul advocate for women's rights and famous Ukrainian writer Lesia Ukrainka, Lesia the Ukrainian. And the poem is called Contra Spam Sparrow. And if you translate it from Latin into English, it translates as against all hope, I hope. Thoughts away, you heavy clouds of autumn. For now, springtime comes, a gleam with gold. Shall thus in grief and wailing for ill fortune, all the tale of my young years be told? No, I want to smile through tears and weeping, sing my songs where evil holds its way. Hopeless, a steadfast hope forever keeping, I want to live, you thoughts of grief away. On poor sad fallow land unused to tilling, I'll sow blossoms brilliant in hue. I'll sow blossoms where the frost lies chilling. I'll pour bitter tears on them as dew. And those burning tears shall melt, dissolving all that mighty crust of ice away. Maybe blossoms will come up, unfolding, singing springtime too for me someday. Up the flinty, steep and craggy mountain, a weighty, ponderous boulder I shall raise, and bearing this dread burden, a resounding song I'll sing, a song of joyous praise. In the long, dark, ever viewless nighttime, not one instant shall I close my eyes. I'll seek ever for the star to guide me, she that reigns bright mistress of dark skies. Yes, I'll smile, indeed, through tears and weeping, sing my songs where evil holds its sway. Hopeless, a steadfast hope forever keeping, I shall live, you thoughts of grief away.
Thank you, Ms. Corin. And if you have a link for your organization and you wanted to put it in the chat for those that were interested, that would be, I'm sure that there are some people who would like to see what your organization is doing and see how they can help. Thank you. Dr. Krajewska, how would you conclude our discussion?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Let me first start by expressing my deepest condolences to our Ukrainian students, alumni, and colleagues. Ms. Decker, Vasil, Maria, Slava, Aliyah, our Ukrainian students, I cannot imagine the heartbreak you're all experiencing, and our hearts are absolutely breaking for all of you. There's so many dimensions to this war in Ukraine that I could talk about, but let me focus on the one subject that is near and dear to my heart, and that is the role of Poland. As many of you know, I am Polish. My entire family lives in Poland, mostly in Warsaw. I grew up in Warsaw. In fact, I was in Warsaw for several months last year, and was there actually earlier this year in January, right before our semester started. Cities like Kiev, other Ukrainian cities that are being bombed right now, look exactly like Warsaw, my hometown. So it's an absolutely unimaginable situation for me to imagine that a city that I grew up in could be destroyed just the way your hometowns and your home cities are being destroyed right now. There are a number of points I want to make, and let me just focus in the interest of time just on the role of Poland here in those last few minutes we have available. The first one has to do with recognizing the serious nature of the threat that Russia and Putin pose. There has been a long-standing debate among scholars and among public officials about whether or not Russia poses a threat to other countries. Notably, officials in Poland and Polish people have for the last 2 decades been very active in viewing Russia and Putin as a threat and trying to call the attention of the European community and others to this threat. It is only now, unfortunately, that many others are fully seeing what Polish officials and citizens have long been concerned about. The current concerns in Poland about Putin and Russia as a result of the invasion of Ukraine, and most recently missiles that have landed and killed many people just a few miles from the Polish border, are obviously very, very, very significant and very, very serious. Poland is a member of NATO and a member of the European Union. The Ukraine is not. Poland has been a very staunch advocate of Ukraine and Ukraine's membership in NATO and the EU for many, many years now. From our own historical experience in Poland, we know what it's like to live right next door to a neighbor that is not friendly to us. And that has in fact been hostile to us in the past. As many of you know, World War II started on September 1st, 1939, with German invasion of Poland, followed just 16 days later by invasion of Poland by the then Soviet Union. Poland lost 6 million people in World War II, the second largest percentage of the population of any country in the world, second only to the Soviet Union. Just like Professor Ellis said, when it comes to Ukraine and Estonia, every single Polish family experienced the pain of war. My own family, similar to Vasil's family, had experiences with members of our family being taken to German labor camps. That was the case with my grandfather, Vasil, as well. My grandmother on my mom's side, on the other hand, was taken by Russians to Siberia at the age of 12 years old, transported through all of Russia, all the way to Siberia in cattle wagons, and endured 6 long and painful years in Siberia with all of her siblings and family. So Polish people know the pain of war and know what it's like to have unfriendly neighbors and to suffer tremendously as a result. We know what it's like to suffer from World War II. We feel the pain of Ukrainians right now. We do not want World War III. No one in the world wants that except for perhaps, as we know, Vladimir Putin. Thirdly, let me focus just briefly on Poland's role in assisting the refugees from Ukraine. As many of you know, Poland has not been receptive to accepting Middle Eastern refugees this past fall, people who have been trying to cross the border between Belarus and Poland. And we now see a huge contrast from that situation when it comes to Polish receptiveness to inviting our friends and neighbors from Ukraine. As of this evening, Poland has taken over 1.8 million people from Ukraine. And here are some reasons why Poland has been so receptive and why Poland has been a destination of choice. First of all, Poland obviously is right next door to Western Ukraine. And there are many Ukrainians who are already living and working in Poland. And they already have, friends and family and roots in Poland. In fact, prior to this war erupting 3 weeks ago, we had approximately 850,000 Ukrainian workers officially working in Poland, paying social insurance contributions and taxes, and probably another, perhaps 600,000 people, on temporary work assignments, and children and youngsters not working. So we have had a lot of Ukrainian people living and working in Poland for the last several years. In fact, when I was in Poland, just several months ago, it is really quite stunning and incredible just to see how reliant the Polish economy is on our Ukrainian friends and neighbors as workers. Every store you go to, every doctor's office you go to, has Ukrainians working, speaking fluent Polish, just contributing to the Polish society and Polish economy. When you go to the websites of major banks, they all have information on their websites in Polish, in Ukrainian, and in English. When you go to doctors' offices, there's information in Polish, English, and Ukrainian to accommodate, again, this large population. Again, approximately perhaps as many as 4% of the population. Poland has about 38 million people. By the way, this is a very similar population size to the population size of Ukraine, with about 40 million. So our countries are very, very comparable when it comes to the size. Now, in the last 3 weeks, Poland accepted 1.8 million people. That number obviously is growing every single day and changing by the hour. That population, 1.8 million Ukrainians who have arrived to Poland, is equivalent roughly to the population of the city of Warsaw, my home city, which has just under 2 million people. So we're talking about a huge flood of humanity arriving at Polish borders. I have to say, I'm incredibly proud of my Polish friends, family members who are accepting Ukrainians into their homes. Every single Polish family is doing something. Again, accepting people, strangers, into their homes. Polish companies are opening their doors, literally accommodating people in empty office spaces. The mobilization of the country has been absolutely incredible, and again, I could not be more proud. Obviously, there are challenges this is going to pose to Poland. Most of this work is actually done by private people and by humanitarian organization and by local governments. Unfortunately, it is not done by the national government as much as it should be. It really is down to individual people and local governments and local organizations. We are, obviously suffering from the COVID-19 crisis. Poland has suffered tremendously these last 2 years. We had a huge spike of COVID infections in the fall and in the winter of this year. So the Polish healthcare system is absolutely stretched to the max. To now imagine we have 2 million new arrivals on top of that is going to be incredibly challenging. And I hope and pray that we can manage. The will is certainly there. I obviously worry that the capabilities might not be there, and I hope that we're going to get help from other countries. Just to tell you a little bit about the situation from the ground, I'm speaking with my family every single day. about what's happening in Poland. There are so many people from Ukraine that have arrived in Poland, especially in Warsaw, that it literally becomes visible on the streets of Warsaw, on the metro system, on the buses. You just see so many of those new arrivals. There are extra buses in Warsaw that take the Ukrainian refugees from the Ukrainian consulate to the Ukrainian embassy to the Polish Foreign Workers Office. There are special buses. Ukrainians can ride those buses in the metro for free. There are places that people can get coffee and tea and food and stuff from their kids, from their babies. Again, the mobilization is absolutely incredible. But just in these last 3 weeks, the population of Warsaw grew by probably approximately 25% with the arrival of about 300,000 people. That is, again, just very challenging, and it's going to be even more challenging. But Polish people know what it's like to suffer the trauma of war. Polish people know what it's like to experience this, and we're going to do everything we can to help our Ukrainian friends and neighbors. So please know, Vasil, Maria, Ms. Decker, that we are with you. And with the people of Ukraine, and we're going to do everything we can to continue our help. In the interest of time, let me finish here because I know there are probably many questions everyone has. Thank you.
Dr. Krajewska, I just wanted to say that, like, when we talk about the tipping point, there is some bad blood between Ukrainians and Poles historically, and I was disheartened when people would still bring up some World War II era stuff, and I was telling, when will finally that stuff will stop and we will move on into the present? And here I saw it finally happened. So you see, the tipping point was reached.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Vasil.
Thank you, Dr. Krajewska. And then the last thing I want to say before turning over to questions is that Wingate also has a direct connection to people who are making efforts to try to help Ukrainians on the ground. We have a student here, Aliyah Pej, whose father is the director of the Ukraine Baptist Theological Seminary in Lviv. In the last 3 weeks, they have stopped doing classes, and the UBTS has turned into a refugee relief site. They have 3 locations where they have now provided aid to 8,000 people in just 3 weeks, and there are hundreds more arriving every day. There is a group of us on campus and in the broader Wingate community who are doing what we can to try to help with this by raising money to help buy food, medicine, other kinds of necessary items. And if you have been moved to want to do something, here is another connection that we have directly to people on the ground who are doing really important work. I'm going to put the link in the chat for this organization. I encourage you to check them out, and if you can, provide a little assistance. It could make a big difference to people who really need help. With that, we have just a few minutes. Would anybody like to ask a question? You could put it in the chat or just ask it. There's a question about the Minsk Agreement of 2015 and a question about what NATO or the US should do. Dr. Ellis, Dr. Thorne, Dr. Krajewska, or others? Yeah, and I see we would be happy to stick around too in case anybody wants to ask questions after time. I'm happy to wait for a while.
Yeah, if I may comment briefly on the Minsk agreements, the whole point of Minsk agreements was to cease fighting in eastern Ukraine in those two areas, Luhansk and Donetsk. And by launching this special operation war on Ukraine, Putin effectively canceled any agreements that were in place. So as we stand right now, no one is referring to Minsk agreements anymore as an instrument because it failed, it was violated. So there is no recourse in that agreement. So at this point, Ukraine is negotiating with Russia. And as you see in the news, there are countries that also serve as mediators or try to serve as mediators. So we are looking into something new to be created, some new agreement. I don't think anyone is going to refer back to the Minsk agreements at this point.
Yeah, that's my interpretation as well. I can't imagine that this would turn into just a Donetsk, Luhansk issue after everything that's happened. There's no way we're going back to that frame of the conflict. But there's a lot of questions that came in real quickly. There's questions about what the NATO or the US or the United Nations should do.
Jake, I'll mention briefly that my general view has been largely in alignment with NATO and the United States and trying not to escalate the war to something much worse. But my take on Putin now is that he's pursuing almost a scorched earth policy at this point. He's realized that he is lost, or at least he is diverting from his initial goals. Targeting theaters and hospitals and clearly targeting civilian populations, I think requires some sort of greater effort on the part of countries that could perhaps do more to prevent those things from happening. And I don't want to put a word on that or what that might look like, but I think this is I think Putin, frankly, is kind of going off the rails a bit in a way that is beyond what even I thought it was possible for him to do, which is astonishing, I suppose.
Kaya, since you raised your hand, I'll give you the last question. I'll do what I can to answer people in the chat afterwards, and we all will.
Okay, so you guys may not know exactly like the answer to this, but I was just wondering, like, what exactly did Putin think would happen when he decided to attack Ukraine? Like, did he not expect for NATO to help Ukraine or like other countries to ally with Ukraine? Like, I just want to know what he expected to happen.
He is in Putin. Well, I think what Putin's assumption is that Ukraine was going to fold within 48 hours of the invasion commencing. He didn't think that the military would put up anywhere near the amount of resistance that it did. I think he assumed mass surrenders. I think he thought that Zelensky would probably beat a hasty retreat rather than digging in Kyiv. I don't think he imagined that the Western Alliance would be able to come together as quickly as they did and implement such devastating sanctions as quickly as they did. There was gross miscalculation on his part, and part of it, I think, was due to simply bad information, bad intelligence. I think part of it was due to Putin operating under a kind of self-delusion, I think, in terms of what the reality was actually going to be when Russian troops moved beyond the Donbass. So that's my take on it, at least.
Thank you. We're now at time, so I need
Professor Wobik, if I may say
Yeah.
just a few words to to address that question, what can NATO do? And I'm also thinking about these institutions like the United Nations. You know, as an attorney trained in Ukraine, we have a code-based system. Think Germany, think Louisiana is inspired by code-based system. And precedent doesn't play a big role in our legal system. So if you understand the code, you can pretty much see, you know, how judge is going to decide. When I came to America, it was a shocker to learn that here, yes, there is a huge body of law, and yes, there is a huge body of cases that show the interpretation of that law. And I wondered how it's possible. And then I remember reading during one of my first classes that here you have a codified system, but you also have equitable remedy. So something that perhaps is not created in the code, in the system, but a judge can create that equitable remedy and apply it. And when I, as an attorney, look at different institutions that were created after the end of World War II to protect countries from any possible conflicts like we have right now, and like Ms. Katerina Decker mentioned, to remember the history, all I see is, you know, this formality. Formally, we cannot engage. Formally, Ukraine is not a part of NATO. Formally, Russia is a member of the United Nations Security Council. Formally. And my call as an attorney who passed the bar and learned about the equitable remedy is, what about equitable remedy in this situation? So that's what I wanted to share.
Thanks. Good perspective. We are at time, so I want to thank all of the panelists, and I want to thank the audience for all your excellent questions. We will be happy to stick around and answer questions for those who want to stick around, but for everyone else, I know that there is some kind of form that people need to fill out for Lyceum credit.
Definitely. Thank you guys for the presentation. And again, we thank the panelists for sharing and expressing their insights concerning this issue. It is with our deepest sincerity that we have you in our minds and in our hearts. For those of you who are waiting on the form link, Carla will put that into the chat. Once you receive that link, go ahead and fill it out, and then you receive Lyceum credit. Again, you can stick around, and I'm sure our panelists will answer any questions that you do have. In the meantime, if you have any questions, just email me. And everyone have a great night, and thank you guys so much.
Lyceum link is in the chat now.
Dr. Bobby.
Yes.
Can I take